Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. We love to really get into it on this show, and today we're looking at this Newsweek article, and this one was sent in by a listener.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, it's called CDC Removes Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity Pages. What Advocates Said.
Wow.
It's from January 31st, 2025, so very, very recent. And I don't know about you, but I was very interested to get into this one.
Yeah, definitely something that caught my eye, too, especially with, everything that's been happening.
Right, and the article doesn't really waste any time getting to the point. It says that these CDC pages that deal with LGBTQ plus health and HIV resources were removed pretty much right after President Trump was inaugurated and signed that executive order.
Right on Inauguration Day.
On Inauguration Day, wow.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just like they were quietly, taken down. It says that visitors would go to these pages and they would get like page not found errors.
Yeah, that's pretty significant. Like they were actively making sure people couldn't access this information anymore.
Exactly. And so I guess my first question is, what are your initial thoughts on this?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that the executive order itself doesn't actually say anything about removing those specific CDC web pages.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like the executive order, it's called Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government.
Okay.
It's more about a broader shift in language and approach within the federal government, like focusing on biological sex differences and using sex instead of gender in official documents and things like that.
So the executive order doesn't specifically say take down these pages, but it seems like the CDC interpreted it in a way that led to them removing these pages.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes this so interesting, right? Like, how much leeway do agencies have in interpreting these orders?
And it's not just a few random pages either. The article lists quite a few, and some of them seem pretty important, like health disparities among LGBTQ youth, supporting LGBTQ plus youth, contraception guidance, even fact sheets about HIV and transgender people. And there was even stuff about creating supportive school environments for transgender and non-binary children.
Yeah, it's a pretty wide range of topics, and they were all just gone.
And then on top of that, the CDC also removed Atlas Plus, which was this interactive tool that people could use to analyze data from the CDC on things like HIV, STDs, and viral hepatitis.
Oh, wow. So taking away access to the raw data as well.
Yeah, and that seems like it could have a really big impact on researchers and public health efforts.
Definitely limiting access to data like that could hinder research and make it harder to understand and address health disparities.
It almost feels like the CDC went above and beyond what the executive order actually said.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what their thought process was.
Like what motivated them to take such strong action.
Right. It really raises questions about interpretation and implementation. Like executive orders give these broad directions, but then it's up to the individual agencies to decide how to actually carry them out.
So the CDC's response here could be like a preview of how other agencies might approach the order.
It's possible, but it's still too early to say for sure. We'll have to see how things play out.
It's like watching this chain reaction unfold with the executive order being the first domino.
Yeah, and it's hard to predict where all the pieces will land.
So where do we go from here? What are some potential long-term consequences of this, especially for the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, I think one of the biggest concerns is that removing those pages, especially the ones focusing on youth, could create this huge gap in information that's easily accessible and reliable.
Right, like if you're a young person and you're struggling with your identity, or you're a parent who's trying to figure out how to support your child, those CDC pages might have been your first stop for accurate information based on science.
Exactly. And now that they're gone, where do those people turn?
It's a really good point. And you're right, those pages were probably a vital resource for a lot of people.
And it's not just individuals who are affected. Professional organizations are weighing in too.
Oh, right. The article mentions the Infectious Disease Society of America.
Yeah, they came out and said they were worried that removing these resources could create dangerous gaps in scientific information, especially when it comes to things like HIV and STDs.
Right, and that brings up another really important point, the potential impact on public health as a whole. Well, if you remove resources that are specifically designed for the LGBTQ plus community, it could make it harder to address health disparities, track trends, and develop effective interventions.
And that could lead to some negative health outcomes down the line.
Exactly.
And going back to Atlas Plus for a second, I'm still stuck on that.
Right, it's a head scratcher.
Like, why would they remove a tool that just gives people access to raw data?
It's one of the most puzzling parts of this whole thing. Atlas Plus was valuable for researchers that could analyze and visualize data on all sorts of public health issues.
So by removing it, the CDC is essentially limiting the ability to study these issues and potentially even impacting funding for public health initiatives.
It's a significant move, for sure. So let me try to summarize this. We have this executive order that's focused on biological sex differences and moving away from gender ideology. And then the CDC seems to be taking it a step further by removing these specific web pages and even a data analysis tool.
It's definitely a lot to unpack, and it feels like we're witnessing something pretty big unfold.
It does, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the reactions to all of this.
Yeah, me too.
Oh,
There's a lot to dig into there. Yeah, it does feel like a really pivotal moment, like we're at some kind of turning point.
absolutely. And the article brings up some of these different reactions to it, which are really interesting.
Oh, yeah, what stood out to you?
Well, on the one hand, you have people like this conservative influencer, Nick Sordor, and he's celebrating this, removal of what he calls woke science.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you have all these public health experts like Jennifer Nuzzo and Miguel Hernan,
Yeah, I've seen their work.
and they're really concerned. They're saying this is going to have a bad impact on public health because we're losing this valuable data.
Yeah, it really highlights how divisive this whole issue is.
Like, it's almost like a microcosm of the bigger societal debate about gender identity and sexual orientation.
Exactly. And I think it shows how important the language we use in these policy decisions can be. Because even if the executive order's language might appeal to certain groups, it could also alienate and marginalize others. And that can lead to some unintended consequences for the people who rely on those resources the most.
That's a really good point, and it makes me think about the impact this could have on trust in institutions like the CDC.
Oh, how so?
Well, the CDC has always been seen as this reliable source of information, a place you go to get the facts about health and science.
Right.
But if people start to think that they're driven by ideology instead of science, could that hurt their credibility?
It definitely could. Their reputation is built on being unbiased and providing accurate information. So if that perception changes, it could make it harder for them to do their job effectively.
And speaking of things that could damage their reputation, the article mentions that they temporarily removed the main HIV page from the website.
Really?
Yeah, they took it down and then put it back up, which just seems odd.
Yeah, that's a strange move. It makes you wonder what was going on behind the scenes.
Like, were there disagreements within the CDC about how to comply with the executive order?
It's possible maybe they were trying to figure out which pages should be removed and which ones should stay up.
Or maybe they were trying to balance following the order with their commitment to public health, especially with such a critical issue like HIV/AIDS.
Right. It's a tough situation for them to be in.
So we have this executive order with its focus on biological sex and moving away from what it calls gender ideology. And then we have the CDC seemingly going a step further by removing these web pages and even a data analysis tool.
It's definitely a complex situation with a lot of layers.
It really is. So if we take a step back and look at the big picture here, what do you think are the most important takeaways from this whole event?
I think for me it shows how crucial it is to have access to accurate information when it comes to public health.
Because,
When that access is restricted or compromised, it can have a ripple effect on the whole system.
like, what kind of ripple effect are we talking about?
Well, it could affect research, data collection, community outreach, even education.
So it's about more than just facts and figures. It's also about trust and making sure that people, especially vulnerable populations, have the information they need to make good decisions about their health.
Exactly.
Yeah, it really highlights how interconnected all of this is. Like when one thing changes, it can have these ripple effects across the whole system.
Exactly. And, thinking about the long-term effects, it makes you wonder about research and community support for LGBTQ plus individuals.
Like, how so?
Well, if researchers lose access to the data from Atlas Plus, it could be harder for them to study health disparities and track trends and develop effective interventions.
That's a good point. And what about the organizations that rely on the CDC for guidance and resources?
Oh, yeah, like community health centers, schools, advocacy groups.
Right, like they might have depended on those CDC web pages for information and support.
Definitely a lot of those groups are going to have to find other ways to get that information now.
And that could mean creating their own materials or conducting their own research, which takes time and money.
It's a big challenge for sure.
And then what about the individuals themselves? If someone's looking for specific information about sexual health or HIV prevention or support for LGBTQ plus youth and they can't find it on the CDC website, where do they go?
That's a really important question, and it's probably the most concerning part of all of this.
Oh, so?
Well, when you remove reliable information from a source like the CDC, it creates this vacuum. And that vacuum can be filled by misinformation or rumors or even harmful stereotypes.
And that could be really dangerous for vulnerable populations, especially people who might already be hesitant to seek help or who are facing stigma and discrimination.
Exactly. It makes it even harder for them to get the support they need.
So, looking ahead, what should we be paying attention to as this situation develops?
I think it's important to see what the CDC does next.
Yep.
Will they find other ways to provide this information, or is it just gone?
Right. And we should also be watching how other federal agencies respond to the executive order.
Exactly. Like, will we see similar actions from other departments? Could this kind of thing spread to other issues?
It feels like we're just at the beginning of this, and there's a lot more to come.
Absolutely. This could have really far-reaching consequences that we don't even fully understand yet.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive, and it's given me a lot to think about.
Me too. It really underscores how important it is to have access to accurate information and to make sure that everyone has the resources they need to stay healthy and informed.
And for those of you listening, we want to leave you with this question. How might the removal of these resources from the CDC website affect your community or your understanding of public health? It's a complicated issue with no easy answers, but by staying curious and informed, we can all work towards a better future.